September 29, 1864, 5:30 a.m., near Richmond, Virginia. General Benjamin Butler stood before 3,000 men in the pre-dawn darkness and gave the most insane order in military history. Remove the firing caps from your rifles. No ammunition, no shooting back, just bayonets, determination, and a battle cry. Private James Thompson of the 4th United States Colored Troops felt the metallic click as he unscrewed the percussion cap from his Springfield rifle. Around him, 3,000 former slaves did the same. The sound rippled through the ranks like a death sentence being signed in triplicate. Heavy fog rolled off the James River, swallowing the valley ahead. Somewhere in that gray wall, Confederate fortifications crowned New Market Heights, earthworks, artillery positions, sharpened wooden stakes driven into the ground at chest height. The Texas Brigade waited up there, elite troops, the Grenadier Guards of the Confederacy. They had rifles, they had ammunition, they had the high ground. Butler's voice cut through the fog. That work must be taken by the weight of your column. No shot must be fired. Thompson looked at the useless rifle in his hands. 3 years ago, he picked cotton in South Carolina. 2 years ago, he wasn't allowed to fight for his own freedom. Now he was about to charge a fortress without bullets. Your cry when you charge will be, "Remember Fort Pillow." Every man knew what that meant. Fort Pillow, Tennessee, 1864, where Confederate troops massacred surrendering black soldiers. No mercy given. None expected today. The order came at exactly 5:30 a.m. Forward. 3,000 men with empty rifles began marching toward New Market Heights. The sun broke through the fog behind them. Ahead, Confederate sharpshooters chambered their first rounds. 12 hours earlier, September 28, 1864, 5:00 p.m., in General Benjamin Butler's command tent, the air hung thick with skepticism. Butler laid out the plan to attack New Market Heights with United States colored troops leading the assault. The reaction from his regular army officers was immediate and unanimous. It would fail. All my brother officers of the regular army said my colored soldiers would not fight. Butler would later recall in an 1874 speech, "Not might not fight, not we have concerns," said, past tense, certainty, as if the outcome was written in a tactical manual somewhere under fundamental military truths. The conventional wisdom made perfect sense on paper. The Confederate defenders were Lee's Grenadier Guards, the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas Infantry, plus the 3rd Arkansas. About 1,800 battle-hardened veterans who had been killing Union soldiers since 1861. Men who chose their profession. Elite troops, the attackers, former slaves, 3,000 men from the 4th, 5th, 6th, 36th, and 38th United States Colored Troops. Most had been picking cotton 2 years earlier. Some still had whip scars on their backs. They had been legally classified as property until 1863. And Butler wanted these men to take New Market Heights. The Confederate position was a masterpiece of military engineering. The heights dominated the New Market Road, the direct path to Richmond. Earthwork fortifications crowned the high ground, built up over months. 2 lines of abatis, sharpened wooden stakes driven into the ground at angles designed to catch charging infantry at chest height. Behind those, the earthworks themselves, with firing positions cut for maximum killing efficiency. The terrain favored defense absolutely. 4 Mile Creek ran across the Union line of advance, forcing attackers into marshland. Ravines channeled any assault into predetermined killing zones. Dense undergrowth and felled trees created obstacles that would break up formations. Confederate artillery, the Rockbridge Artillery, and 3rd Richmond Howitzers had pre-ranged every approach. The Texans and Arkansans waiting in those trenches had seen this before. They knew what happened when infantry charged fortified positions. They had done it themselves at places like Gaines Mill in 2nd Manassas. Attacking uphill into prepared defenses was how you created casualty ratios of 10 to 1, 15 to 1, sometimes worse. General John Gregg commanded the Confederate forces at New Market Heights. His men called themselves the Grenadier Guards. Without irony, they were professionals. They held formations under artillery fire. They knew when to volley, when to fire at will, when to fix bayonets and countercharge. And now they would face former slaves attacking without ammunition. In the Confederate trenches that night, men cleaned their rifles and checked percussion caps. The abatis was sharp. The artillery was loaded with canister, anti-personnel rounds that turned cannons into giant shotguns. The firing positions were dry. Every tactical advantage belonged to the defenders. At 800 defenders against 13,000 attackers, the math looked bad for the Confederates, but the terrain, fortifications, and experience gap made those numbers irrelevant. The real ratio was professional soldiers with rifles versus former slaves with empty guns charging uphill through a swamp into sharpened stakes. The white officer's verdict was unanimous: slaughter. Butler gave the order anyway. 5:30 a.m. The 4th and 6th United States Colored Troops stepped from the tree line into hell. Confederate sharpshooters opened fire immediately. Private Joseph Williams, Company E, 4th USCT, saw the man beside him drop without a sound. Then another. The rifles cracked from elevated positions in the woods ahead, invisible kilos picking targets. The column pushed forward into the ravine. Captain S.W. Von Nuys of the 4th USCT led his company down the slope toward 4 Mile Creek when Confederate enfilading fire caught them from the left flank. Von Nuys fell dead in the ravine, his body sliding into the marsh water. But the column kept moving. They drove the Confederate sharpshooters from the woods through volume of presence alone, 3,000 men moving like a flood. Then they hit the swamp. 4 Mile Creek had turned the valley into marshland overnight. The neat assault columns dissolved into chaos as men sank knee-deep, waist-deep into mud and water. Formations broke apart. Officers screamed orders that couldn't be followed. The fog lifted just enough to show what waited ahead: the abatis. 2 lines of sharpened wooden stakes, each driven into the ground at chest height, angled toward the attackers. Behind those stakes, Confederate earthworks. Behind those earthworks, the Texas Brigade with loaded rifles. The 4th and 6th USCT hit the first abatis line at full run. Men impaled themselves on the stakes trying to break through. Others got caught between the wooden spears, trapped in killing zones, while Confederate rifles fired from 15 yards away. Sergeant Alfred B. Hilton, 4th USCT, carried the Baltimore regimental flag toward the Confederate breastworks, pushing through both abatis lines while men died around him. He made it to the edge of the earthworks. A Confederate bullet tore through his chest. Hilton collapsed forward onto the flag, crying out as he died, "Save the flag!" The entire color guard went down, 6 men carrying flags and protecting the flag bearers, all killed in the same narrow space. Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood saw the Baltimore flag falling and lunged forward. He grabbed it from under Hilton's body. The flag had 30 bullet holes. The Texas Brigade poured fire into the abatis. Men couldn't advance through the stakes, couldn't retreat back through them. They were pinned in the open, taking fire from elevated positions. Colonel Samuel Duncan, watching from the rear, gave the order to fall back. The 4th and 6th USCT withdrew in good order. They reformed. Duncan ordered them forward again. They charged back through the swamp, back through the marsh, back into the abatis. Confederate rifles cut them down in the same spots. Duncan ordered retreat a second time. The regiments fell back, reformed, and charged a third time. By 7 a.m., the 4th and 6th USCT had lost half their forces. Union pioneers with axes had managed to chop gaps through the abatis during the chaos, creating narrow passages toward the Confederate line. But those gaps were death funnels. The Texans simply aimed at the openings and fired. General Benjamin Butler rode forward to observe the carnage. What he saw would stay with him the rest of his life. 543 dead soldiers lying in a space not wider than a clerk's desk. Bodies stacked on top of bodies. Men who had died trying to save the man in front of them. The abati was red with blood. At 7:30 a.m., Butler gave the order for the second assault wave. The 5th, 36th, and 38th United States Colored Troops, 1,300 fresh soldiers, prepared to charge across the same ground, now carpeted with their dead comrades. 7:30 a.m. Colonel Alonzo Draper studied the ground ahead and made a tactical adjustment that would save hundreds of lives. The first wave had charged straight into the worst terrain, the tangled undergrowth, the deepest marsh. Draper shifted his column to the right, finding better footing through young pine trees, instead of the deadly funnel where 543 men now lay dead. The 5th, 36th, and 38th United States Colored Troops, 1,300 soldiers, stepped over their fallen comrades and advanced. Among them, Corporal Miles James, Company B, 36th USCT. James had been enslaved in Princess Anne County, Virginia until 1863. He enlisted in February 1864, 7 months ago. Now he moved forward through the marsh toward the same Confederate earthworks that had just slaughtered half the 4th and 6th regiments. Draper's column hit the abatis gaps that Union pioneers had chopped through during the first assault. The gaps were narrow. The Texans above had simply adjusted their aim to fire directly into those openings. The 36th USCT pushed through anyway. Miles James was 30 yards from the Confederate breastworks when the bullet hit him. The impact shattered the bone in his arm. Not a clean wound, not something you bandage and walk off. The bone exploded into fragments that tore through muscle and artery. James dropped his rifle and collapsed. A field surgeon reached him within minutes. One look at the mangled arm and the decision was immediate. Amputation. Right there, 30 yards from Confederate rifles, while the battle raged around them. The surgeon removed Miles James's arm on the battlefield. What happened next would become legend. James picked up his rifle with his remaining arm. He braced the stock against his body, loaded a cartridge one-handed, a process that normally required 2 hands and took trained soldiers 15 seconds. He fired toward the Confederate line. Then he loaded again and fired again. Around him, men from the 36th USCT were trapped in what Colonel Draper would later describe as half an hour of terrible suspense. They had reached the abatis. Confederate fire poured down from elevated positions. Men sought cover behind dead bodies and returned fire, losing all forward momentum. It was the moment every assault died, when soldiers stopped advancing and started surviving. Miles James refused to stop. Blood streaming from his amputation site, rifle braced against his body, he moved forward through the abatis, shouting for men to advance. Not ordering, James was a corporal, not an officer, just showing them it could be done. If a one-armed man wouldn't quit, how could they? The psychological effect was devastating. Men who had taken cover behind the abatis stood up. The 36th and 38th USCT surged forward. They hit gaps in the Confederate line that the first wave had died creating. They climbed over the bodies of the 4th and 6th regiments. They reached the earthworks. The Texas Brigade, having held this position through 3 separate charges, finally broke. Not because they were defeated militarily. The Confederates still had ammunition, still had the high ground, still had fortifications. They broke because soldiers who wouldn't die when you shot them were a problem no tactical manual addressed. Confederate defenders began withdrawing toward Richmond. Miles James, with one arm, continued loading and firing his rifle until the Confederate line collapsed. His commanding officer, watching from behind, would write in his official report, "He's worth more with his single arm than half a dozen ordinary men." At 8 a.m., 2.5 hours after the first assault began, the 36th and 38th United States Colored Troops stood atop New Market Heights. Miles James stood with them. 7 months later, on April 6, 1865, he would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. He would refuse medical discharge from the Army, insisting on serving until October 1865, 6 months after the war ended, with one arm. But at 8 a.m. on September 29, 1864, he simply reloaded his rifle and waited for orders. 8 a.m. New Market Heights belonged to the United States Colored Troops. The Texas Brigade, Lee's Grenadier Guards, withdrew toward Richmond in fighting retreat formation, not routed, not panicked, but retreating. The Confederate defenders, who had held this position through 3 separate assaults, who had inflicted 850 casualties while suffering only 50 of their own, were abandoning the heights. The 36th and 38th USCT stood atop the earthworks they had been deemed incapable of taking. Below them, the abatis was painted red. Behind them, 543 bodies lay in a space General Butler would describe as not wider than a clerk's desk. The Baltimore regimental flag, riddled with 30 bullet holes, flew over Confederate fortifications. General John Gregg, commanding the Confederate defenders, received the news that changed everything. Fort Harrison had fallen. While the United States colored troops had drawn Confederate attention to New Market Heights, General Ord's column had stormed Fort Harrison 2 miles south. The outer defenses of Richmond were collapsing simultaneously. Gregg ordered his Grenadier Guards to fall back to forts Gregg, Gilmer, and Johnson, the inner defensive ring around Richmond. The New Market Road lay open. This wasn't just a tactical victory. The strategic implications cascaded immediately. Robert E. Lee, commanding Confederate forces at Petersburg, 40 miles south, had been locked in trench warfare with Ulysses S. Grant for 4 months. Both armies were dug in. Neither could break the other. Lee's defensive positions at Petersburg were considered impregnable, but now Richmond, the Confederate capital, faced direct threat from the north. Lee had no choice. He pulled 10,000 troops from the Petersburg defenses and sent them north to defend Richmond. 10,000 soldiers stripped from trenches that were already undermanned. The Petersburg line weakened immediately. This was Grant's actual objective. New Market Heights and Fort Harrison weren't about taking Richmond. They were about forcing Lee to weaken Petersburg. Grant was playing chess 3 moves ahead, and 3,000 black soldiers with empty rifles had just executed the combination that would win the war 6 months later. At New Market Heights, the mathematics of the battle defied military logic. The Confederate defenders, 1,800 elite troops, had inflicted 17 times more casualties than they suffered. By every tactical measure, they had won the battle. Their defensive position had functioned exactly as designed. Their marksmanship had been devastating. Their fortifications had channeled Union forces into killing zones, but they had lost anyway. The 4th and 6th USCT lost half their forces in the first assault. They withdrew, reformed, and charged again. The 5th, 36th, and 38th USCT lost over 1/3 of their forces in the second assault. They kept advancing. When soldiers were shot down, others stepped over their bodies and continued forward. The Confederate defenders had never faced an enemy that would absorb 17-to-1 casualty ratios and still capture the objective. Professional military doctrine said armies broke at 30% casualties. The United States colored troops at New Market Heights took 50% casualties in the first wave and charged again. General Benjamin Butler, who 12 hours earlier had heard his officers say colored soldiers would not fight, now rode across captured Confederate earthworks held by those same soldiers. On September 30th, Lee would counterattack, trying to recapture the lost positions. The attack would fail. The United States colored troops entrenched on New Market Heights would hold their ground. The Confederate outer defensive line was permanently broken. Richmond had 8 months to live. September 29th, 1864, 9:00 a.m. General Benjamin Butler dismounted his horse and walked through the killing ground. 543 bodies lay in a space he would later describe as not wider than a clerk's desk. Men stacked on top of men. The abattis, those sharpened wooden stakes designed to impale charging infantry, was painted red from the base to the tips. The Baltimore regimental flag, riddled with 30 bullet holes, flew over the captured Confederate earthworks. Butler had commanded troops for 3 years. He had seen battlefield casualties at Fort Fisher, at Bermuda Hundred, at Big Bethel. But this was different. These men had charged without ammunition in their rifles. They had absorbed 850 casualties, while the defenders suffered only 50. They had taken losses that should have broken any military unit, losses that every tactical manual said would cause immediate rout. And they had won anyway. 12 hours earlier, Butler's regular army officers had told him with absolute certainty, colored soldiers would not fight. Not as speculation, as fact. These same officers had predicted slaughter, disaster, humiliation. They had been right about the slaughter. They had been catastrophically wrong about everything else. Butler examined the Confederate fortifications his troops now occupied. The earthworks were professionally constructed, proper firing angles, reinforced parapets, pre-positioned artillery supports. The two lines of abatis had been expertly placed to create overlapping fields of fire. The high ground, the swamp below, the ravines channeling attackers into kill zones, every advantage had belonged to the defenders. The Texas Brigade and Arkansas troops defending this position were Lee's elite soldiers, the Grenadier Guards, professionals, veterans of campaigns from Seven Pines to Gettysburg, men who knew their business, and they had retreated from former slaves. The mathematics of the battle made no sense by conventional military standards. The Confederate defenders had inflicted 17 times more casualties than they suffered. By every tactical metric, they had won decisively. Their defensive position had functioned perfectly. Their marksmanship had been devastating. But the ground belonged to the United States colored troops. Butler would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate what he witnessed that morning. In 1874, 10 years later, he would give a speech describing how completely September 29, 1864, had transformed his understanding of courage, determination, and human capability. The transformation wasn't just philosophical, it was immediate and strategic. Butler's diversionary attack had worked beyond Grant's expectations. New Market Heights and Fort Harrison, both captured by 8 a.m., had forced Robert E. Lee to strip 10,000 troops from Petersburg to defend Richmond. The Petersburg line, previously considered impregnable, now had gaps. On September 30th, Lee counterattacked, trying to recapture the lost positions. The United States colored troops, entrenched on New Market Heights, held their ground. Lee's counterattack failed. The Confederate outer defensive line was permanently broken. Butler understood the broader implications immediately. Fort Harrison was the strategic prize. It opened the country north of Richmond and forced Confederate forces within 3 miles of the capital. But New Market Heights was the statement. Black troops had destroyed the outer defenses of Richmond without firing a dozen shots. Earning respect cost lives. Butler evaluated that cost as he stood among 543 bodies in a space not wider than a clerk's desk. The price was catastrophic. The result was undeniable. Every officer who said they won't fight now stood corrected by corpses and captured fortifications. April 6, 1865, 7 months after New Market Heights, 6 days before Robert E. Lee would surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, the Medal of Honor ceremony took place in a country that was about to win a war. 16 men received America's highest military decoration for their actions on September 29, 1864. 14 of them were black soldiers. 2 were white officers who led them. This wasn't symbolic recognition. This was the Congressional Medal of Honor, the award created in 1862 for soldiers who distinguished themselves conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity beyond the call of duty, the highest honor the United States military could bestow, and 14 former slaves were receiving it simultaneously. Sergeant Major Christian Fleetwood, who saved the regimental flag riddled with 30 bullet holes after the entire color guard was killed. Corporal Miles James, who continued fighting with one arm after battlefield amputation. First Sergeant Powhatan Beatty, Sergeant James Bronson, Sergeant Robert Pinn, First Sergeant James Gardner, Private William Barnes, Sergeant Major Thomas Hawkins, Sergeant Alfred Hilton, who carried the flag to the Confederate breastworks and died crying, "Save the flag." And 5 more. Each man's citation documented impossible acts of valor, not courage under fire. Every soldier showed that. These were acts that defied tactical logic, advancing when wounded, holding positions after officers fell, rallying broken formations under artillery fire, capturing fortifications that professional military assessment deemed impregnable. The numbers told the story General Butler's officers hadn't believed throughout the entire Civil War. 4 years, dozens of major battles, hundreds of thousands of Union soldiers, only 16 black men received the Medal of Honor. 14 of those 16 earned it in 2.5 hours at New Market Heights. For comparison, at the Battle of Gettysburg, the war's largest engagement with 50,000 casualties, 28 men received Medals of Honor. At Antietam, the war's bloodiest single day, 23. The Battle of New Market Heights, a diversionary attack that most Civil War histories barely mention, produced 14. The timeline compressed the transformation impossibly tight. In 1862, these men were property under United States law. In 1863, they weren't allowed to serve in combat units, relegated to labor battalions if permitted to enlist at all. In 1865, they wore the Medal of Honor, 3 years from enslaved to Medal of Honor recipient. The battle itself had achieved its strategic objective perfectly. By capturing New Market Heights and Fort Harrison, Butler's attack forced Lee to strip 10,000 troops from Petersburg to defend Richmond. Those gaps in the Petersburg line would contribute directly to Lee's inability to hold the city. When Petersburg fell on April 2, 1865, Richmond fell immediately after. Lee surrendered 6 days later. But the tactical victory was secondary to what New Market Heights demonstrated. The regular army officers who told Butler that colored soldiers would not fight had their certainty destroyed by 543 bodies in a space not wider than a clerk's desk. The Confederate Grenadier Guards, who inflicted 17-to-1 casualty ratios, still lost the ground. Every argument against black military service, and those arguments filled congressional records, newspaper editorials, and military doctrine, collapsed under the weight of 14 Medals of Honor. The legacy extended far beyond 1865. The Battle of New Market Heights became foundational evidence in every subsequent debate about military integration. When the military integrated in 1948, New Market Heights was cited. When civil rights activists demanded equal treatment in the 1960s, they referenced the United States colored troops. A memorial now stands at the battlefield site. The ground where 543 men died without firing their rifles is preserved as a testament to what determination costs. General Butler never forgot what he witnessed on September 29, 1864. In his 1874 speech, 10 years later, long after the war ended, he could still describe the space where the bodies fell. He spent the rest of his life defending the rights of black Americans, citing New Market Heights as proof of capability that no rational person could dispute. 14 Medals of Honor proved what 543 deaths had purchased: respect.